observe the world, you see people, you see houses, you see the sky, you see tangible objects. But when you observe yourself within, you see moving images, a world of images, generally known as fantasies. Yet these fantasies are facts. You see, it is a fact that a man has such and such a fantasy. And it is such a tangible fact, for instance, that when a man has a certain fantasy, another man may lose his life. Or a bridge is built. These houses were all fantasies. Everything you do here, all of the houses, everything was fantasy to begin with. And fantasy has a proper reality. That is not to be forgotten. Fantasy is not nothing. It is, of course, not a tangible object, but it is a fact, nevertheless. It is, a form of energy, despite the fact we can't measure it. It is a manifestation of something. And that is a reality. That is just a reality as, for instance, the peace treaty of Versailles or something like that. Yeah. It is no more. You can't show it. But it has been a fact. And so the psychical events are facts, are realities. And when you observe the stream of images within, you observe an aspect of the world within. And so, you see, the man who is going by the external world, by the influences of the external world, say society or perceptions, sense perceptions, thinks that he is more valid, because this is valid, this is real. And the man who goes by the subjective factor is not valid because subjective factor is nothing. Yeah. No, that man is just as well based because he is bases himself upon the world from within. And so he is quite right, even if he says, there's nothing but my fantasy, And as the world in general, particularly America, is extroverted like hell, the introvert has no place. Because he doesn't know that he beholds the world from within. And that gives him dignity, and that gives him certainty, because it is, nowadays particularly, the world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. Assume that certain fellows in Moscow lose their nerve or their common sense for a bit, and the whole world is in fire and flames. You see? It is, nowadays we are not threatened by elementary catastrophes. There is no such thing as an H-bomb. That is all man's doing. We are the great danger. The psyche is the great danger. What if something goes wrong with the psyche? You see? And so you see, it is demonstrated to us in our days what the power of the psyche is of man, how important it is to know something about it, but we know nothing about it.
One of the tremendous things which Jung did was to always emphasize the aspect of man's totality. And our totality is not complete unless we take our human failings into it. It doesn't mean that I necessarily have always to live my human failings. I obviously may have to take responsibility for them. But they are not only part of me, but they are part of every human being. That is to say, it is part of man.
Consciousness is one factor, and there is another factor, equally important, that is the unconscious, that can interfere with consciousness any time it pleases. And of course, I say to myself now, this is very uncomfortable, because I think I am the only master in my house, but I must admit that there is another somebody in that house that can play tricks. If you are unconscious about certain things that ought to be conscious, then you are dissociated. And then you are a man whose left hand never knows what the right is doing and counteracts or interferes with the right hand. Now, such a man is hampered all over the place. Yes. Maybe you know that what the unconscious has to say is so disagreeable that one prefers not to listen. And in most cases, people would be probably less neurotic if they could admit the things. These things are always a bit difficult or disagreeable or inconvenient or something of the sort. So there is always a certain amount of repression.
In each of us, there is a rejected part, the which can become the cornerstone, like it's written in the Bible. And we have to be aware of the stinking side, of the bad-smelling side, of the, as Jung says, about the urine, about the excrement, and all that in our life.
In psychological terms, though, Pluto, Shiva, represents what is known in consciousness as the shadow self. Now, you see, in the schemata of the consciousness, we're out here. We're out here in the realm of persona, which is the word for mask. We're out here in the Hollywood drama, right? The mask, the show of masks. And we become so identified with this extreme edge of consciousness, the fashions, what are we going to look like, you know, appearances, and the whole 9 yards. Now, of course, a certain amount of persona we need. Otherwise, we'll be wide open to attack. You need the mask in order to conceal your real identity, to protect yourself and generally, and to operate in the world with other fellow human beings. But we have way overcompensated for it. We've put all our psychic energy into the mask. And you only have to look at the cosmetic commercials to know that it's obsessive right now. Behind that is the ego, the waking consciousness. And this little battery runs down every 12 hours or so you need to sleep. That's because it's finite and it's energy, and you need to sleep to restore its energy. When we wake up in the morning, we have a thing called ego consciousness, ego waking consciousness. But the ego is a strange kind of thing. And anything that your ego or you do not like about yourself, you repress. And the repressions of all the stuff that you despise about yourselves becomes what's known as the shadow personality. And it's kind of in the unconscious realm. It's not even in the conscious realm because you're not aware of it. It's like the director's cut of your life. See, when you're living your life and experiencing all sorts of things, you want to have the nice clips that you cut out and put them on the coffee table, the family album. But what about the backstory that's really been filmed, that footage that you hide away, that one day when you leave this planet is going to be played for you in the dark room? They're going to say, come this way. We've got something to show you. Remember all that film you stored away in the attic, meaning your unconscious mind? We're going to run you an amazing film here. This is a real slasher horror one. This is Stephen King and more. You want to see the John Carpenter, you know, Friday the 13th, part 14? Here it is. The shadow is the repressed stuff that we don't show to the world, and we even forget. Now, for those who find it hard to understand what repression is, it's forgetting something and then forgetting that you forgot about it. It's the skeletons in the closet. And again, it's a very necessary part of the human mind. We need it to survive. It's like the dumpster. You need to throw the trash out. But we've, again, overcompensated. We're doing it too much. And it causes enormous psychic problems. Carl Jung said that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. For no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. He's talking spiritually there. He's saying that for you to be integrated, you're going to need to integrate with your shadow, because those are aspects of yourself that you've thrown away. And you're not getting to the light. See, the self, the true person, is way back here. For the hell, you can forget about the self. We're into ego world. And the ego is doing itself a disservice by constantly denying aspects of its own self. Now, you know something? There was books left out of the Bible, and it's important to start finding out why. Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, this is one of the great Gnostic Gospels that was thrown away, when you see your likeness, you rejoice. But when you see your images which come into existence before you, which neither die nor are made manifest, how much will you bear? Now, it's very flowery language, a different language, but can you see now what is being said here? When you see your likeness, you rejoice. Meaning when you're in the persona, and you're in the world of, oh, I play the fashion game and everybody then gives me acknowledgement and I give acknowledgement, you rejoice. But when you see the primordial images which come into existence before you, but these which are neither die or are made manifest, meaning the unconscious mind, how much then will you bear? It's an old story. Yeah, looking at who we are, it's all it's about. The only solution, the solution is to look at who we are. As Alexander Pope said, know then thyself. Presume not God to scan, the proper study of man is man. William Blake said, thine own humanity learn to adore. But Carl Jung put it this way. He said, look, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to stop from facing their souls. Ever been outside recently? Ever turned on the TV recently? He's exactly right. People will do anything, no matter how absurd. And all that carnival that you see out there and all the distraction and nonsense that this world is wall to wall full of, that's what he's talking about. I must live in the Bahamas. I must live in a one-season world. I don't want to be looking at any of that stuff. Well, then okay. But then you've just condemned the world to horrors. You're just making a person in your life, your partner or your children, the victims, the slaves to your inability to face yourself. You're now having a person fill your void and your emptiness because you're not a whole person. And now you've enslaved that wife or that husband or that child or that animal or your workmates to your own form of tyranny. Yeah, you can't call the police on it and you'll never get the court over it to prove that it's there, but it's there. And basically, repression doesn't work. There's a thing known as the return of the repressed. You can only dump so much of it before the stench starts to, come back. And as Carl Jung said in a well-known statement, he said, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside of you as fate. Ha, ha, ha. Because there's a strange contract between the unconscious energy of our minds and the world, the energy that built the world. They conspire together. They're built out of the same stuff. So behind the back of the ego, the unconscious mind, the shadow, conspires with life, with material existence, to bring in front of you the very people, the very person, the very challenges, right? To help you integrate when you won't do it of your own free will. And we call that living. All the stuff that happens around us that we often describe as difficult challenges, that's what that is. We will refuse to do the homework, so then we're going to meet it in space and time. As the Greek said, your character is your fate. Now, as we said, the investigation, something interesting about the mind, is that when you try to do investigation of your own self, it's not easy. Partly because of these defenses, partly because of the monitoring of the superego. So the very action of trying to observe yourself is difficult. It comes with complications. Partly the cacophony, right, created by our interactions with the Mitwelt and the Umwelt also block it out. The noise and cacophony of the external world and our entanglement in those realms, often the racket of it, you see, blots out the other dialogue. Remember that Monty Python sketch where they were sitting in the boardroom asking why people don't get enlightened? And one of the characters reads from a paper and says, we've discovered that it's because people become, and just as he's about to say distracted, he gets distracted and sees this skyscraper crashing through the window. Very, very good point, though. Alan Watts says it, nothing so eludes conscious inspection as consciousness itself. This is why the root of consciousness has been called, paradoxically, the unconscious. And Jung says that to find out what is truly individual in ourselves, profound reflection is needed. And suddenly we realize how uncommonly difficult the discovery of individuality is. Now, Fromm says that Freud found that if the analyst touched on repressed material, the patient would resist his therapeutic approach. This is not a matter of conscious unwillingness on part of the patient, or of dishonesty, or of secretiveness. He's defending himself against the discovery of the unconscious material without being aware either of the material or of his resistance. The patient can turn away from the sensitive topic and talk about something else. He can feel sleepy and tired. He can find a reason not to come to the interview. Or he can become very angry against the analyst and find some reason to quit the analysis. Projection, right? All these defenses. In other words, what's happening is we're hiding from ourselves. Theodore Reich says that the ego has built mighty defenses against the forbidden impulses that drive and push to gain some measure of expression. They are pressed into oblivion, into the dark abyss of rejected and condemned emotions and thoughts. They are disavowed, banned, and outlawed, and live in the netherworld, never to be mentioned. In panic fear of their power, man has rolled obstacles as strong as the rock of Gibraltar before the door to prevent their return. They betray themselves nevertheless and give notice of their subterranean existence and activity in little unexpected signs, words, and gestures. They give themselves away in spite of shame and fear. Remember I said the imperial self isn't going anywhere? You can't kill it. You can only cage it, but it's not going to die. It's not going to go away. Christopher Lasch says that 20th century peoples have erected so many psychological barriers against strong emotion and have invested those defenses with so much energy derived from forbidden impulse that they can no longer remember what it feels like to be inundated by desire. They tend rather to be consumed with rage, which derives from defense against desire and gives rise in turn to new defenses against rage itself. Outwardly bland, submissive, and sociable, they seethe with an inner anger for which a dense, overpopulated, bureaucratic society can devise few legitimate outlets. Theodore Reich says that one of the most important measures of civilization to make that aggressiveness harmless can be studied in the evolution of the individual. It will be turned inside, introjected, and taken over by that part of the ego called the superego that now, in the form of conscience, exercises aggressiveness against the ego. And he's talking about the superego's totalitarianism, psychic totalitarianism. The tension between the strict superego and the subordinate ego is called a sense of guilt, and it manifests itself in the need for punishment. Now, whence does this sense of guilt come, he asks. In the first stage can be best designated as a dread of losing love. Obviously, one of the first anxieties is not just the physical act of being born, but the idea that you might be separate, that separation from the mother. But more than that, it's the bad deed is one that, when discovered, would be followed by the loss of love. So the child is very innocent. It doesn't realize that if it breaks a window or breaks a vase or does something, pulls the cat's tail or whatever, it doesn't realize, in its mind, it is really dealing with the fact that that single act might lose it completely the sustenance and love and succor of the parent. Look how powerful the parent is. And the parent will manipulate this as well. The tyrannical parents manipulate that fact. That's why all this beration to the child, you're just this and you're just that and you're going to get a spanking, I'm going to tell dad when he comes home and all the rest of it. Working on the child's fear of losing that love. And of course it's even more extreme in certain cases. Now at this state, the sense of guilt is still a social anxiety. It will remain that in its core. That means anxiety that the father or mother and later the community will disapprove of and punish the misdoer. As a parent can exploit that, so can Big Brother. Now, feelings of guilt occur after one has committed a forbidden deed. The sense of guilt that is later developed is often unconscious and sometimes perceived only as some kind of vague anxiety or uneasiness, for instance, in many obsessional cases. It is in its later phases, anxiety towards the superego, so to speak, dread of the superego. We analysts have been inclined to assume that any kind of thwarted instinctual gratification results in the heightening of a sense of guilt. Freud's newest insights convinced him that this is valid only for the aggressive instincts. You feel guilty when you feel a welling up of aggression. But watch this. In other words, the origin of guilt feelings is in the area of aggressive instincts. Unconscious elements were originally made unconscious because such thoughts and impulses were not tolerated by parents and teachers in earlier years, and continued recognition of them would be anxiety-provoking. In order to defend the ego against anxiety, resistances are built up against the recognition of these unconscious impulses, which Reich is saying the most important one is aggression, or anger, right? But if the child's aggression is legitimate, which it often is, at being controlled, at being manipulated, at being thrown hither and thither, having its mental, all this catch-22 and control play that goes on, the whole drama, right? That child's response that Reich is talking about but didn't mention could be a legitimate expression against being controlled. So the dynamic then is that when natural and perfectly legitimate anger and aggression rises up, as he said, it gets interjected. Now women interject more, men project. Hence bulimia and anorexia and many of the other syndromes that women suffer, even in fact bad eyesight. It's all related to the interjection of anger. But what he forgot to say is that if it's legitimate, then look at the mess that you're in. You're guilty over a natural expression. And this then becomes a syndrome that just keeps on spiraling out of control. You end up with a big Cheshire grin, as everything's all right. Or you try to ascribe, oh yeah, I was a bad kid, I can understand what they did. And you go through all of these justifications. So the instincts that arise in the child, he's in a terribly compromised situation. And this is working higher up the fractal as well. This is how Big Brother is also working. You have the guilt over natural instincts that should be allowed to be communicated. And then you interject that anger towards yourself. It's a terrible syndrome. Because as a matter of fact, as I said before, crime in the physical outplaying of violence and sadism, as it's normally called, has been well documented. But the worst crimes are done to the self, and they're not documented. We're very, very young in understanding this whole concept of self-sadism, or masochism as it's often called. Don Miguel in the Four Agreements says, in your whole life, nobody has ever abused you more than you have abused yourself. And the limit of your self-abuse is exactly the limit you will tolerate from someone else. If someone else abuses you a little more than you abuse yourself, you will probably walk away from that person. But if someone abuses you a little less than you abuse yourself, you'll probably stay in the relationship and tolerate it endlessly. So again, we ask, when you think about yourself, are your thoughts positive or negative, creative or destructive, loving or violent? Lang says that the only death we recognize is biological death. And it is a bit of a bizarre concept because we don't normally think of people walking around, being dead, because they're walking around. But the fact of the matter is that you can psychologically be dead, self-murdered. How can that person do any good in the world? They create havoc wherever they go. And we can't expect the world to be good or pleasant or civilization to move forward until every shred of the self-sadism is erased. So fixing things on a governmental level is only a small, small part of the action that's required. We have to deal with this inner self-sadism, the violence we commit to ourselves on a daily, even momentary basis. When all of that stops, then and only then is the person capable of going out and affecting true change in the world. Nature is the self. Self is nature. If you have self-sadism against the self, of course you're going to act in an ecocidal manner. But you see, the thing is that this terrible paradox again, the idea that aggression is rooted in the true self-seeking expression. And a society that just can't handle it. So the women interject, the men project. But you see, the thing is, even Freud would admit, don't expect that repression to just disappear. That which is repressed, that anger is boiling inside and is going to come out in war and in violence and in family feuds and whatever else. It'll always find a way out.
What you would call the personal shadow of people didn't upset him. He just grumbled and cursed a bit. But that's not the problem of evil. It's that major evil of complete destruction which worried him. The collective shadow
has to do with the dark side of the archetype of the self. That means it's the shadow of the God image. In the Christian tradition, it would be the devil. And that has always been personified and felt as something which has not to do directly with the human being. I mean, if somebody is possessed by the devil, he's much worse than just, he's not human, it's demonic. And but on the other hand, generally that merges. First you have this area of dim, dark side, and behind it lurks the other. So you can say the personal shadow is the bridge to the collective shadow, or the open door to the collective shadow. But the collective shadow comes up in those terrible mass psychoses. It's like if you have a room and there's one door not shut, and there the devil can come in. And if you know your personal shadow, you can shut all the doors.
And his real approach to that was the inner work
yes,
that he did.
The only thing you can do, to confront yourself with it where you are. All the rest, all the benevolent, if benevolent preaching would help, then we would be out of the trouble long ago, because we get a lot of benevolent and reasonable preaching, but it doesn't help. So the only place where you can really put the hand on it and deal with it body to body, the problem of evil, is in yourself. And there you have the hope to change something, but the hope to change the world is a childish illusion.
In Jung's understanding, there is a natural gradient towards wholeness, not towards perfection, but towards knowing all of ourselves, to recognize the darkest corners as well as the light corners, and to recognize, as Blake said, without contraries is no progression. You need that grain of sand there to cause that continual grind. You need that world of contraries to bring out the very best of your strength. And that natural gradient will go through and try to pick that up. That is true both negatively and positively. Perhaps it would be helpful at this time to look at a model of Jung's understanding of the psyche. Remember, this is only a general format. Every person is individual in their actual dreaming and in their actual process. But this is how he saw the general pattern. If we take this circle as the self that includes the known, the unknown, everything, and if we hold this line as the threshold of consciousness, by threshold I mean it's that space when you're waking up, when you just come over into this world, or you can fall back into sleep. Here is the unconscious, here is the so-called world of consciousness. Between those two is this little tiny ego. Tiny little thing. And yet all of our world, our reality, moves through that space. It's partly in the unconscious, partly in consciousness. In the unconscious, as Jung understood it, there are these floating islands in this vast sea. And these are known as the complexes. They are energy centers, and they have at their core what he calls archetypes. And those archetypes are immense energy, divine energy, that have the power to knock the ego right out. They also, however, are essential to human beings in that it's from that archetypal world that poetry, music, all the great arts come. And of course, religion is from that space. Now the complex comes into action when something out here in the ordinary world attracts it. I'll use an addict as an example because it's so clear with an addiction. Supposing I had no loving mother. Not because she didn't love me, my mother, but because through her generations behind her, she didn't know how to look at me as I was, or at me as, she saw me as she wanted to be, but it wasn't my reality. So somewhere along the line, I developed a craving for sweetness, a craving for nourishment, for life. I happened to put this onto chocolate or any other food that was sweet and could give me that feeling of being loved. So I see the chocolate. I want the chocolate. If I have a weak ego, the ego cannot tell me, no, you shouldn't have any more chocolate. So I come past the ego and go for the chocolate. I go right up through that unchallenged line. Supposing I try to say to myself, I won't have the chocolate. It may be that the archetype will say, I will. And I don't care what you think, what your ego wants to do, I want the chocolate. I've always had the chocolate. I always will have it, and I will go direct to the chocolate. The ego has been wiped out, and we are really in a complex situation. From the Jungian point of view, this is a very dangerous space to be in because the ego has lost its power, the complex is taken over, and the archetypal energy is at work. Now, in a well-working psyche, the ego is strong enough to hold that complex in abeyance. And yes, let it develop, let it mature, but not to allow the archetype to take over. The archetype will be more powerful than the ego later on. When, for example, you have an ego strong enough to write, well trained that it can play music, and the ego can be forgotten while the archetypal energy is moving through. Or in prayer, for example, the ego is out of the road, the prayer is coming through. the archetypal energy is essential to life in the dimension that we as human beings relate to it. We start out with an understanding of the shadow. In Jungian terms, the shadow is the same gender as the ego. It is the part of us that we do not know. It's in the unconscious. And we must remember, unconscious means unconscious, not knowing. There's something that wants to come through, tell us something, and we must recognize that every dream is giving us something new from the unconscious. So the shadow is that part of us that we do not know. Or it may be a part of us that was buried when we were very, very young. For whatever reason, we didn't have a chance to live that side. We were shamed for it. We were humiliated. We weren't in our own peer group. And so we stepped away from it and buried it and hoped we would never see it again. The other side of the shadow is the bright, creative, full of vibrant life shadow. The creature that is hidden within us, who has never dared to come out. Or, as a child, when it dared to come out, we were told, we don't do those kind of things here. And we knew that we had done something wrong. But if that shadow does emerge, that creative shadow, everything may become, yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. Now we are going to look at the structure of a dream. I think it's very important to realize that the archetypal structure in narrative is the same in a simple dream as it is in a classical play. It is in us, that structuring of the archetypal energy. Take, for example, Macbeth. Very simple plot. We have the introduction, the rising action. I'm sure you all learned this in grade 12. The climax, the denouement, and the end of the dream is the lysis. That little part on the end that tells us where the energy wants to go. There are 5 parts to a classical play. And if we could remember the entire dream, there would be 5 parts there, but very few of us can remember them. Most of us just get the lysis. But that is very, very important, as you will see in a moment. In the introduction, we are given the characters, the plot, and the setting. We see that there may be some kind of conflict developing even in the introduction, but it is highlighted as it moves through the rising action. 2 conflicting energies begin to meet. Then they come to the climax, and something happens there that turns the energy of the play. So you begin to see whether the outcome is going to be good for the hero, quotation marks, or whether he is going to be destroyed. In a dream, this lysis is terribly important. Let me give you an example. A man dreams that he's been walking through a jungle, and he's been into one ambush after another in that jungle. And he goes through the jungle cutting off one big leaf, steps through. He has no idea where he's going, but he just keeps cutting off one leaf. And gradually he comes to a river. And he is so happy to be at the river. Finally, he's finished with the jungle. He looks across the river, and behold, there's a jungle on the other side. That does him in. He can't go any further. And then he realizes that somebody has been cutting through the jungle on the other side, coming to meet him. That divine presence has been coming through on the other side, and so he has the strength to go on. The lysis will carry the energy into the next place of action. Often we only get the lysis of the dream, but if we get even that, we know where our energy is trying to go. We are left breathless if we follow our dreams and really understand symbol. The tragedy in our culture is that so many people do not believe in symbolic language. And so they try to satisfy a spiritual yearning with a physical food or alcohol or drugs or silk underwear, whatever the addiction is. That cannot work. There is no satiation point for a spiritual longing by physical means. So long as that symbol is not alive as a living symbol, it cannot do its work to bring us into our totality.
We are born into a pattern. We are a pattern. We are a structure that is pre-established. Nature will take her course. She will become that which she is from the beginning.
Most of you are familiar with Joanna Macy and her work, is that true? Yeah. And so you know her phrase, the great turning that we're in the midst of now in the world. The great turning from an industrial growth society that is undermining the foundations of life on the planet. So a transition from that to a life-sustaining society, or actually societies, and perhaps even eventually, of course, a life-enhancing human communities. And Joanna speaks of 3 dimensions of the Great Turning and saying that all 3 are absolutely essential. We need to have all 3. And very briefly, because probably all you know this already. The first dimension she calls holding actions, which are in essence whatever we can do in any arena to save as much life in terms of as many species and as much habitat as we can while the industrial growth society is collapsing, hopefully sooner than later. And the second dimension is, shorthand, is creating new infrastructures of all sorts for life-enhancing societies. The way we grow our food and where our energy comes from and how we educate and how we help humans, help ourselves grow into our full humanity. And the third dimension is, she refers to as a shift in values or consciousness, a change in our understanding of what the world is and who we are. And this is essential. So you could say, from my perspective, that maybe the first dimension is most urgent, saving as much life as we can. And maybe the second dimension is right behind it and laying the infrastructure, which there are people like yourselves and people and organizations all over the world creating the structure for new ways of being human. And but for me, the third dimension is maybe not most urgent, but ultimately it's most foundational. That if it's the case, as I believe, that the reason we're in this very challenging time in the world, if that's because the contemporary mainstream cultures have largely forgotten what it is to be human and how to raise healthy children and how to become true adults and how to grow real elders. If that's the case, and I believe it is, then ultimately to have healthy, mature cultures again, to reinvent healthy, mature cultures, we need to attend very carefully to what it is to be human and how we raise children and support teenagers and ourselves to grow into our full humanity. So that is the big experiment in our little way that we've been engaged in for 30 years now at our institute that's based in Colorado, which is called Animas Valley Institute, because we're in southwest Colorado in the valley of the Animas River, which is Spanish for souls. So in some ways, what Janine is addressed tonight and does address in her work is a shift in consciousness that changes our understanding of what the world is. And in particular that it's an animate world, that everything is alive. And if we can again experience the world that way, the world itself changes because of that, and we change as well. Now, my own work is, in addition to that perspective, my angle has been more on shifting our consciousness of who we are, what it is to be human. In a sense, remembering again what it is to be human and to grow fully human. And when we do that, again, the world changes. If we change, the world changes. And so my feeling, my understanding is that we need, in the contemporary Western world, we need to help each other shift our understanding of what it is to be human. And in particular, our work at Animas has been to reinvent contemporary versions of initiation processes. And one particular initiation process, because there's many initiations, there's many passages in life and many processes. And my understanding has become that there's actually nine major passages in life, and there's 8 major stages that we're designed by nature to go through. And our contemporary mainstream Western cultures really only help us, and poorly at that, get through 3 stages, and then we there's too many, there's too large of a percentage of contemporary people who get stalled in stage 3, which is early adolescence. So early adolescence is not to be confused with our early teen years. Our early adolescence is a psychological stage that starts in our teen years and is meant to end about the middle of our teen years. And it tends not to end. The next major life transition is death. Which means the last major passage before that was puberty. And adulthood, what we call adulthood, has become a slightly accessorized, polished form of early adolescence. And our mainstream contemporary cultures fully support that. And you might even say have been very deliberately designed to keep people from growing past early adolescence, because there'd be no one interested in a consumer society that is eating up the world if people matured beyond that. So there's an initiation process. Birth is an initiation process for the mother and the child and the family and the community. And the next major passage in life is usually around between age 3 and 4, when we become conscious of ourselves as individual humans. Our conscious self-awareness develops then. That's an initiation process. And then puberty is an initiation process into early adolescence, where life becomes about peer group, society, and sex. And the task in early adolescence is to develop a personal, social presence in the world that is both socially acceptable to our peer group and authentic. And the authentic, it turns out to be the hard part in a conformist society. Think about that. So, I mean, it's relatively easy to develop a socially acceptable personality if you don't care about being real, if you don't mind being a fraud. And it's easy to be authentic if you don't care about not having any friends. So if you're interested in both, it's challenging in a healthy culture, and in ours it's really, really very difficult. So we tend to get stalled there. Plus, because of developmental difficulties in the first 2 stages, which are childhood, we have a hard time, so many people have a hard time with early adolescence. Okay, so our work is actually primarily for people who have had a healthy enough early adolescence that they've made it through the next passage into late adolescence, which is a rare achievement in the contemporary Western world. And that passage I call confirmation. And what's being confirmed is you've got a personality that is authentic enough and socially acceptable enough. And you have created a house of belonging, and a social house of belonging in your world that works. And you could spend the rest of your life living out of that house. Congratulations, now it's time to leave. Forever. Close the door, you can burn the house down when you leave. You won't need it anymore. It turns out that first house of belonging was just an exercise to show yourself that you can create a presence in the world that works. Good work. Now you're going on to the initiation process of discovering who you actually are on a deeper level, on a soul level, and discover by that what you were born to do and to be. And by the way, what you were born to do and to be in this life has everything to do with the gift that was born with you or as you, that your people need and the world needs, and your community cannot be healthy without you, and without your knowing what this gift is and embodying it in the way you live your life. And by the way, culture cannot be healthy unless you take your place in it, and the world cannot be healthy without healthy cultures. So you're going to this initiation process, and it's not going to be a weekend workshop. It's going to be several months at the shortest, and maybe several years, and there's no guarantee you'll survive. Are you ready? So, okay, but back to the work and what we're doing at Animus Valley Institute, this experiment of short experiment so far of 30 years of creating initiation processes that are after confirmation, confirming again that we have an authentic, acceptable personality, and also confirm that it's time to ask the big existential questions about life, namely, who am I really? What is the mystical gift I was born with or as? Why is there death? What is true community? What is poetry about? What is the difference between romance and sex? And so on. These big questions that healthy teenagers start asking, even in our societies, and usually don't find elders or adult initiators to say, yes, great questions. We're now going to invite you out of your everyday village life, and you're going to go into this process of initiation. So, I call this the process of soul initiation, and what I mean by soul is different than a lot of people what they mean, and I'm not right about what I mean, I just have my particular definition, and you'll need to know what it is if we're going to talk about it. My shorthand definition is, by soul I mean a thing's ultimate place in the world. I say thing because not only humans have souls, everything has a soul, everything has its ultimate necessary place in the world, and we as humans are no exception. So for me, soul is to talk about a kind of place or a niche in the world. And for me, soul is not a substance. It's not even a metaphysical substance. It's the place we were born to take. And the place is not primarily a cultural place. That's where it kind of gets difficult, given what we've learned in our Western societies. The place that we were born to take is not a particular vocation or social role. It's something that in the Western world we consider mystical. It's not really mystical. I think in healthy society it would just be, yeah, well, of course. So it's something that you could say it's mythical. Our soul place is of dream, symbol, metaphor, myth, archetype, those kinds of things. And so the difficult idea that was really difficult for me to grasp for a long time is that we're each born to take a particular place, a unique place in the ecology, in our ecosystem, first and foremost. That soul is ecological, it's of nature. That every place that anything has, including us, is a place in the natural world. And by the end of early adolescence, we have finally come to understand the kind of place we can take in society, that the kind of job that might work for us, and the kind of way we might be known, the kind of personality we might be known as among our people. That's cultural. Soul is mythic and ecological. So it takes a very profound shift in the way we think about ourselves in the world to go through this soul initiation process. And what we find in myths and traditions all around the world is that the soul initiation process has three major phases, and they are often illustrated by a U. And so it's phase 1, 2, 3, and the first phase in the soul initiation process is dying. Not physically, hopefully, that can happen, but dying to everything you understood about who you are that you learned in early adolescence, and everything you believe about what the world is. It all has to crumble. Some of it will come back, but you don't know which pieces. So the first phase is dying or severance, and the second part of the process is, you could call it being dead, or betwixt and between, or it's just the underworld time, or the sacred world time, where our consciousness it's more like moonlight consciousness, and everything has these multiple challenging meanings. Whatever we encounter is not fully, we can't fully understand it by our first take, in that things are symbolic and have meanings. So there's the dying process to who we thought we were. There's the gathering of the dream, the vision, the myth of our life, which is not cultural. It is more of the mythic. We call it the mythopoetic dimension. And then there's the third phase of returning back to our everyday life with as much of those symbols and deeper meanings. The purpose. Another way to speak of soul is it's our the true deepest purpose of our life, the meaning of our life, which has everything to do with the place we were born to take. And once we return, the next thing that happens is we need to find ways to deliver that gift to our people, or to the more than human community, through almost always some cultural role or vocation or job, and so forth. So then the task is, how am I going to bring this mystical meaning, understanding of who I was born to be? How am I going to deliver that? What jobs would count as that? So let's see. Here's a poem. You can talk about these things forever, and at some point it's like, what? It's difficult to talk about this briefly. But some poems often will fly beneath the radar of our everyday conscious minds and sneak in where just other talk doesn't work. So this is a piece from a British poet whose name is David White. How many people know David's work? A lot. That's great. And this one is called All the True Vows. All the True Vows. And in this poem there's two truths and two promises that you can keep your ears open for. And the two truths turn out to be the same truth. And the two promises are very different promises. And if you make one, you can't at all ever make the other. Not ever, but you can't make them both at the same time. Okay, here it is. All the true vows are secret vows. The ones we speak out loud are the ones we break. All the true vows are secret vows. The ones we speak out loud are the ones we break. I'll step over here for editorial comments. I'll try not to make too many during the poem, but I wanted to connect the dots here with the process of soul initiation. Soul initiation is a process where we have to make that kind of vow at some point. The kind of vow that needs to be a secret vow at first. Okay. All the true vows are secret vows. The ones we speak out loud are the ones we break. There's only one life you can call your own, and 1,000 others you can call by any name you want. Hold to the truth you make every day with your own body. Don't turn your face away. Hold to your own truth at the center of the image you were born with. Don't turn your face away. Hold to your own truth at the center of the image you were born with. The truth at the center of the image you were born with. Those who do not understand their destiny will never understand the friends they have made, nor the work they have chosen, nor the one life that waits beyond all the rest. By the lake, in the wood, in the shadows, you can whisper that truth to the quiet reflection you see in the water. Whatever you hear from the water, remember, it wants you to carry the sound of its truth on your lips. Remember, in this place, no one can hear you. And out of the silence, you can make a promise it will kill you to break. That way, you'll find what's real and what is not real. I know what I'm saying. Time almost forsook me, and I looked again. Seeing my reflection, I broke a promise and spoke for the first time after all these years in my own voice, before it was too late to turn my face again. So when we're young, maybe even younger than you, maybe when we're just like 3 years old, we make a promise that we forgot, we don't remember that we made. And the promise we made was, I agree not to sing in my true voice if I can get psychological and social safety in exchange for that. And it's exactly the right promise to make at that tender age. That if we don't make that promise, we're not going to survive to ever enter the initiation process. We have to. It's part of being human. We have to make that promise. That I have to fit in culturally first. And I have to fit in my family. And if my family's not so healthy, I'm going to have to put a bigger lid on more of me. But even if my family's healthy, I'm going to have some lid on embodying my true wild magnificence. So we make that promise, and during the initiation process, at some point we have to break it. We have to agree that we're going to speak in our true voice, we're going to sing our true song. And through that, we enter into a conversation with the world that goes through a phase towards the end of the initiation process where we discover what the largest, this is another phrase from David Whyte, we discover the largest conversation that we can have with the world.
Jung puts the burden squarely on each person, and this psychology of individuation, of making what you are, and what you've inherited of the universe, of making that specific, of making what you've got of the collective in you, making that individual, and carrying it as an individual, and not only standing still in it, but allowing an act of becoming in the midst of your being, to become your own way of moving through life. This is the hardest thing you can ask of human beings.
You know, when you study science fiction, you see there's always the fantasy of escaping to some other planet and begin anew again, which means give up the battle on this earth. Look, consider it hopeless and give up. I think one shouldn't give up. If we would reflect more, that's why reflection comes in. There are many people who are not in analysis, but if they are naturally gifted, which I would call if they are honest, they can find these things without analysis. I've lived in this tower sometimes 3 weeks alone without speaking to one word to anybody. And I sometimes thought I was going off my head. But the unconscious became alive. It was my partner. There are a lot of people who go through life and the unconscious is no reality to them. They say at breakfast I had a funny dream, and that in the afternoon they don't know anything about it anymore. But if they paint them and interpret them and think about them, the dream becomes real. And that's why you have to be lonely, so that the unconscious becomes stronger. It's like loading up the unconscious, and then it manifests. Hermes Trismegistus said in one active imagination to an alchemist, I am the friend of whoever is lonely. We have now, you see, it's a man who pours water into the fish. Now the fish is the unconscious, the content. So we have to support the unconscious. It's not enough to just have it. We have to actively turn towards it and support it so that it then helps us.